Okay, let's get into it. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking on some really dense source material straight out of the Federal Register from October 2023. Our job is to turn this stuff into what you really need to know.
And our mission today is, well, it's a study in regulatory extremes. We're diving into two actions that really show you how the whole machinery of government works.
I mean, on one hand, we've got this absolute, you cannot negotiate this safety mandate for aging jets.
Exactly. And on the other, a completely different animal,
Yeah.
a deliberate, multi-million-dollar policy decision to slash a fee related to, of all things, personal citizenship status.
It's the ultimate yin and yang of federal oversight, isn't it? We're going from mandatory maintenance on an Airbus A300.
All the way to the cost of renouncing your citizenship.
So for you, the learner, the big question we're digging into is really fundamental. How does the government draw that line?
Right. When does technical necessity, like keeping a plane from falling out of the sky, when does that completely override any and all cost concerns?
And then, on the flip side, when does pure policy things like public access or easing a regulatory burden force the government to intentionally lose money on a service, even when they know exactly what it costs them?
It's a fascinating look at where that risk analysis stops and where political will really begins.
Let's start with structural failure, because that just sounds urgent. Our first source is an airworthiness directive. AD docket no, FAA 2023-1895.
And just to be clear, these airworthiness directives, or ADs, are serious business.
This isn't a suggestion.
No, not at all. The FAA is legally required to issue them when they identify an unsafe condition on an aircraft model. Here, the condition was a determination that, and I'm quoting, new or more restrictive airworthiness limitations are necessary.
Okay, so what is the specific risk they're trying to deal with?
Well, it's the kind of thing that you don't want to think about when you're at 30,000 feet. We're talking about fatigue, cracking, damage, or corrosion.
Oh, wow.
And not just anywhere, but in the airplane's principal structural elements.
So the actual bones of the aircraft.
Yeah.
The frame, the spars, the things that keep it all together.
It's absolute bones.
Yeah.
The risk is officially defined as reduced structural integrity.
That phrase alone tells you everything. Reduced structural integrity. That's why the FAA can't wait. And this type of maintenance, it falls under ATA code 05, right? Which is for time limits and maintenance checks.
Exactly. This is not about fixing a broken coffee maker in the galley. This is about resetting the fundamental clock on how long those core parts can safely operate before they have to be inspected or, replaced.
And we know which planes are affected.
We do. The AD applies to some specific older Airbus models, some real workhorses, mostly the A300 B4600 series and its variants. So you're looking at the B4601, the F4605R, that kind of thing.
These are planes that have been flying for a long time.
A very long time. And the FAA is just making sure they meet the current safety bar.
Now, here's a piece I find interesting, the international angle. The FAA isn't just inventing this out of thin air. They're mandating compliance with a directive that was already issued by EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency.
That's right, from back in May 2023. And that's pretty standard practice. Aviation safety is a global game.
But there's always a but.
There is, and this is where it gets really telling. This is where the FAA decides to show its own regulatory teeth. While they adopt the technical stuff from EASA, they impose a dramatically stricter timeline.
Okay, explain that difference, because that speaks volumes about how urgent the FAA thinks this is.
So the EASA directive gave operators 12 months, a full year to revise their maintenance programs to include these new structural limits.
A year seems reasonable.
You'd think. But the FAA, in contrast, is telling U.S.-based operators they have to revise that entire program within just 90 days.
90 days. That's a fourfold increase in urgency, going from 12 months down to 3.
That's massive.
Why? Why would the U.S. see this risk as 4 times more immediate than the Europeans?
Well, there are a few possible reasons. It often comes down to fleet characteristics, maybe regulatory philosophy. The U.S. fleet of these particular older Airbuses might have different usage profiles.
Like more takeoffs and landings, more stress on the airframe.
Could be. Perhaps more intensive freight cycles, or maybe they just have a higher proportion of the very oldest models still flying. The FAA is basically signaling that, look, whatever the European timeline is, we believe the risk for our domestic fleet is immediate.
So they're not waiting. They're forcing compliance now.
Absolutely. So if you're an airline operating one of these planes, the cost of updating your manuals, training your people, implementing these new checks, it's irrelevant.
It's mandatory.
It's mandatory, it's immediate, and the cost of not doing it is, well, potentially catastrophic. And just one more technical point. This AD is what's called a terminating action for an older directive.
Meaning it replaces something that was already in place.
Right. Think of it like this. The government isn't just adding another patch to a leaky pipe. They're taking out an old temporary fix and replacing it with a brand new permanent updated valve. It's a final, non-negotiable change to the plane's life clock.
Okay, so there we have it. The federal government steps in, mandates costly, immediate action to protect lives and structural integrity. Cost is a complete non-issue. It's secondary to safety.
Right.
Which sets up this incredibly contrast with our next source. Here, the structure isn't metal, it's citizenship. And suddenly, cost is the only thing anyone is talking about.
That's our pivot. We're shifting from that mandatory mechanical safety to a really high-stakes, policy-driven financial decision. We're looking at a proposed rule from the Department of State. It's about the Certificate of Loss of Nationality, the CLN.
And this is the headline part. The proposal, RIN 1400 AF61, lays out a massive fee reduction. We are talking about dropping the fee to process a CLN request from the current $2,350.
All the way down to $450.
That's an 80% decrease. In an era where government fees only ever seem to go up, seeing one drop by nearly $2,000 makes you ask, why was it so expensive to begin with?
And that's the key. The State Department isn't arguing the service is cheap. They're actually arguing the exact opposite.
Okay.
They make it very clear that processing a CLN is incredibly resource intensive. For consular officers overseas, for staff here at home, it is not just filling out a form.
There are legal safeguards.
Huge ones. Constitutional and legal safeguards to make sure the person's decision is truly voluntary and intentional. The officer has to sit down with them and confirm they fully understand the serious consequences. The loss of rights, the loss of obligations. That takes a lot of time from a high-level officer.
Which brings us to the history of this fee because it really tells a story of policy, demand, and some very precise accounting.
It does. Back in 2010, when the fee was first brought in, it was set at $450.
The same price they're proposing now.
Exactly. And crucially, the State Department admitted back then that $450 was less than 25% of the actual cost to the government. They were already taking a huge loss on it.
So why do that? Why intentionally undercharge?
It was a clear policy choice. They set the fee below cost, and they said so to lessen the impact on those who need this service and not discourage the utilization of the service. They wanted it to be accessible.
But then, that very accessibility kind of created its own problem, didn't it? What happened between 2010 and 2014?
The demand just exploded. In 2010, they processed about 950 requests. By 2014, with that low fee, the number shot up to over 3,400.
That is a staggering increase.
Oh.
A 360-fold jump. It must have been consuming a ton of resources.
Way more than they'd budgeted for. So in 2014, they responded, and that's when the price jumped from $450 all the way up to $2,350.
And they had a justification for that number.
Oh, a very specific one. They turned to modern government accounting. The new price was determined using the department's cost of service model, or COLSM. And that model uses a method called activity-based costing, or ABC.
Okay, for those of us who aren't regulatory accountants, why is activity-based costing so important here?
ABC is the government's gold standard for proving an expense. It's incredibly meticulous. It identifies every single action, the time an officer spends in an interview, the paperwork, the domestic review, and it assigns an accurate dollar cost to it. The entire goal is for services to be self-sustaining.
So the $2,350 fee wasn't just a number they pulled out of a hat.
Not at all. It was the calculated, proven, actual cost to the American taxpayer to provide that service.
So the system worked. They proved the cost. And yet here we are, and they're proposing to just throw out that careful accounting and go back to the subsidized rate. What happened? What policy shift was so powerful it overrode their own numbers?
Public concern. The feeling persisted that the $2,350 fee was acting as a major financial deterrent. And while the department doesn't officially track why people renounce, there was very strong anecdotal evidence pointing to one thing.
Let me guess.
Taxes.
Taxes. Specifically, the costs of complying with a very complex U.S. law, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FACA.
FACA. Most people have heard of it, but can you just briefly explain what it did to the average American living abroad?
Sure. FACA basically turned every foreign bank into an unwilling agent of the U.S. Treasury. It put a huge reporting burden on U.S. citizens living overseas, even people with very modest assets. They suddenly needed expensive accountants and lawyers just to stay compliant.
So this compliance burden is what likely drove that huge spike in people wanting to renounce their citizenship.
That seems to be the logical connection. The high fee for renouncing wasn't just a cost recovery tool anymore. It became this final financial hurdle for people trying to escape the administrative nightmare created by another federal regulation.
I see. So the State Department made a policy decision, a crucial policy decision. They decided that even though their own ABC model proved the service costs over $2,000, they needed to go back to the subsidized below-cost fee of $450.
Which is essentially the government admitting our own rules have become so complicated and burdensome that we have to step in and absorb this other cost so we don't block people from exercising this administrative right.
That's a perfect summary. They're aligning the CLN fee with other services for citizens abroad, which are often set well below cost as a matter of policy. And this is not a small amount of money.
What's the financial impact?
Based on their projections of about 4,600 applications a year, this change will mean a reduction of about $8.8 million in payments to the Treasury every year.
Wow. That is a direct, measurable annual cost the government is willingly choosing to eat, all to alleviate a public burden.
Exactly.
So if you put these two sources right next to each other, it is just a stunning contrast in how the government thinks about money.
It really is. The FAA directive is a classic case of structural risk just trumping cost. Safety first, period, end of story. The cost to the airlines is mandatory, it's expensive, but it's non-negotiable because the risk is human life.
But then the Department of State's rule on the CLN is policy completely trumping cost. They use the gold standard of accounting to prove the service cost $2,350.
They did.
Yeah.
But because of these policy concerns, accessibility, deterrence, probably made worse by FAA, they are deliberately setting the fee at $450 and taking an $8.8 million annual loss.
So in both situations, the government is defining a necessity.
That's a great way to put it. For the FAA, the necessity is mandatory maintenance to prevent a catastrophic failure. For the State Department, the necessity is administrative access to keep from deterring citizens no matter the real cost. It's that tension between technical safety and, well, political reality. So
to recap our deep dive today, we saw mandatory, immediate, and very expensive compliance forced on airlines for aging Airbus planes, driven by the FAA's aggressive 90-day deadline.
And then we explored the State Department's decision to slash a citizenship fee by 80%, from over $2,000 back down to a subsidized $450, all because of policy concerns about financial deterrence.
And that leads us to the final thought we want to leave you with.
The Department of State, after doing all the math, after meticulous costing, decided to subsidize the CLN service by 80%. The goal was to make sure citizens weren't deterred from exercising their right to renounce. And this decision, it explicitly prioritizes policy goals over the self-sustaining cost recovery principles that are supposed to govern these things.
So the question for you to think about is this. What other vital administrative processes, could be anything from getting documents for tax compliance to permits for critical infrastructure, should the government step in and heavily subsidize based purely on the idea of avoiding public deterrence or easing the burdens created by its own complex regulations?
Yeah.
That's a fundamental debate about the role of the government's checkbook.